Natalie Neita-Garvey, welcome to Profile.
Thank you.
I was almost tempted to say Headley, and people will find out in a moment why.
Yes.
But first, a Cliff Notes version for those who are not necessarily as familiar with your career, and we will talk a little bit about it during the course of the program. So, Member of Parliament for St. Catherine North Central, four-term Member of Parliament, by the way. Your life of service began long before politics. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. Former cabinet minister with portfolio responsibility for sport between 2011 and 2016, credited with introducing Jamaica's first athlete insurance plan and launching the national sports policy. Also served as deputy leader of government and opposition business in the House of Representatives as well. Veteran HR practitioner. We'll talk a little bit about that because it's on the internet listed, but yes. I don't think people know much about your working life outside of politics, with over 29 years rather in both public and private sector roles, and currently the opposition spokesperson on local government and participatory democracy. When you hear all of this, I see the big smile. What do you think?
I don't know who they're talking about, really. It just all seemed to have gone so seamlessly over the years, and from one role to the next, but all centered around service. And that's just been my life and my mantra. So I feel like I would have accomplished some of those things that I had set out for myself when I was 12 years old. So I'm comfortable with where I am.
And by the way, this is just some of the list, by the way.
Yes.
There's skipping among all of that. Several leadership roles, for instance, in the People's National Party, the party of which you've been a part.
Yes.
But let's go back to the beginning and talk a little bit about the thing that's not on the internet.
Okay.
Which is how you grew up and where you grew up. And that story begins in Browns Hall, St. Catherine.
Absolutely. I believe it's the center of the universe. Browns Hall, St. Catherine. A dynamic community that had leaders who served as our mentors, and I grew up with grandparents who loved me and who I loved dearly. Having been left with them since I was 3 months old, I really didn't know my mother in a real way until much later in my life. So I grew up with grandparents who, some would say, spoiled me and made me feel as if I was the most special person there was on earth. I think that has a lot to do with who I am today. But Browns Hall had some of the best churches. I mean, if you know Mr. Warmington is my cousin, actually, you know.
It's Everard Warmington.
Yes, Everard Warmington. We also have relations to Mr. Golding as well, Bruce, who spent some time in Browns Hall with his family. Tatius Golding High School, which is in Browns Hall, is Bruce Golding's father.
Yes.
So we are a community which has produced quite a number of leaders who have made great impact in Jamaica and across the world.
And for people who don't know where Browns Hall is, tell us a little bit about it.
So Browns Hall, if you're coming from Spanish Town, we would be about 17 miles heading towards Dovecot. I went to church there recently, last weekend actually. And the churches are not doing so well anymore, and it's disappointing for me because that was a great part of what shaped my life as well.
How so?
I was that child who had to be involved in everything. I was the singer, the poet, the actress in most of the plays, the Christmas, Easter cantata. Mrs. Sewell was our school principal. And I learned the poems that I remember till today. Some of them didn't make much sense, but I remember them because they were such a great part. And that is how I learned. I grew up in a shop, a grocery shop. And at 3 months old, I believe I became the community's baby, because my grandmother was a shopkeeper. My grandfather was the person who went and bought goods in Old Harbour. Old Harbour is our closest town. But I recall her being everything. She was the shopkeeper, she was the cook, she was the housekeeper, just a very industrious, dynamic woman who just did it all. And so I learned how to do it all from very early. And so life just evolved in that way. At 12 years old, I would have gone to a political meeting with my grandfather, which is across the road, because the shop is directly in front of the primary school at Browns Hall.
Right.
At that time, Roddy Lawson was vying to be Member of Parliament. And the song Young, Gifted and Black played in my ears for the first time. I knew then that I needed to serve because I wanted to do that. So Browns Hall, I can't even imagine having had a childhood without that experience. I was happy. I was blessed. I never went a day hungry. And I was always in a position to help somebody else. That was important to me. So I would take from the shop and feed my friends during lunchtime. And that was critical because I didn't want to see anybody else hungry. It's so ironic, Archie, that I can tell you, most of my friends at school didn't have shoes at that time. And when I got my first pair of shoes, because my mother would send things, she was abroad. She had gone to study, she had left. I should have mentioned that when she left at 3 months old, she got a scholarship, so she went off to England to study and then went on to work at the United Nations for 29 years of her life, so she was in New York. And I remember when I got my first pair of shoes for school, I didn't want to go to school in those shoes because my friends didn't have any shoes. So I wore the shoes to the school gate and took them off and put them in my little bag and then walked into the schoolyard because I didn't want to feel like I was different or better than anybody else.
And from that primary school, you would go on to go to St. Jago High School and St. Hilda's.
Yeah.
But we're going to be getting to that in the next segment of our program. We're going to be taking our first break on Profile. My guest is Natalie Neita-Garvey. She is 4-time Member of Parliament and a proud daughter of Browns Hall. And we're back with you after these messages.